in the past few lessons, we've been exploring different arguments for the existence of God from a philosophical perspective. Well, in this lesson, what we're going to do is talk about a critique of these arguments, specifically arguing more generally about the non-existence of God. And this begins by talking about probably one of the most common arguments, which is the problem of evil. Now, the problem of evil is probably one of the most classic challenges to the philosophical existence of God, because obviously it contradicts with our intuitive assumptions, about how God would be if he was to be someone that existed in real life, and also how the world acts and how the world is operating in today. So it can be divided into two major arguments. We've got the logical argument, and we've also got the evidential argument. And these are obviously very similar in their philosophical logic. However, they do share some slight differences. So the logical argument is very simple, okay, and this is probably the most prominent understanding for the existence of a problem of evil, for the existence of God. It can also be described as the so-called inconsistent triad, because it looks at the attributes of God and compares those attributes to the real world and the existence of evil in the world, and comes to the conclusion that if this existence of evil, if there is an existence of evil, if this is true, which it is, then we can therefore to say that God cannot exist under these circumstances. So that goes a little bit like this. So premise 1, God is omnipotent, omniscient, and wholly good, okay, or omnibenevolent, all loving as well, okay. So these are describing the attributes of God. The second premise is that an omnipotent, omniscient, and wholly good being would eliminate every evil that it can eliminate. This is just a simple conclusion almost that's drawn from the first premise. That if it is the case that there is some omnipotent, omniscient, and wholly good being that exists, then they would eliminate all evil that it can eliminate. The third premise is evil exists, which an omnipotent, omniscient, and wholly good being could have eliminated. So again, just drawing on the first and second premise. Therefore, premise 4, God does not exist. So it is stating that there is the existence of this being that is omnipotent, that can do anything. There's the existence of this being that is also omniscient, knows everything, and they're also wholly good, okay, or they're all loving. And it's assuming that if this kind of being exists, then they would eliminate any evil that they can eliminate. And because evil exists in the world that could be eliminated by this omnipotent, omniscient, and wholly good being, then either we have a situation where evil does not exist, or we have a situation where God does not exist. And the most logical conclusion from that is, assuming that we know that evil exists, which we can come to that conclusion quite simply, then we can therefore conclude that God does not exist. Now, there are a number of issues with this logical argument, okay? So we can make a number of critiques against it. We can attack the truth of the premises, suggesting that the argument is not sound. So if we take the look at this argument again, we can take a look at each premise and actually attack all of them on the basis of them not being true. So premise 1, God is omniscient, omnipotent, and wholly good. Well, we could attack this argument by suggesting that this sort of beligns a Judeo-Christian understanding of how God operates. And don't forget, there have been many other religions in the world, and this is not even a Judeo-Christian, but almost an Abrahamic religion, a kind of trope that exists within Abrahamic religions, that God is omnipotent, omniscient, and wholly good. God could also just as easily be some kind of Aristotelian prime mover. So the idea that God just simply caused the events to take place in the universe and is completely transcendent from all of individual life. That could be the case, and in which case that would absolve from any kind of expectation of trying to eliminate evil. The second premise we can also attack. We can say that this premise is saying that if God is omnipotent, omniscient, and wholly good, then they would eliminate all evil that they can eliminate. And we'll get on to why we can attack this argument in a minute, because we can talk about something called a theodicy. And then the third premise, evil exists even though this omnipotent, omniscient, and wholly good being could have eliminated it. Again, we can attack this premise from two angles. A, we can go down the theodicy route, which we will do in a second, but we could also suggest and make the argument that evil does not exist, and that we can take quite a scientific understanding of how the world works, of how people act, and things like that. And this leads us to a distinction between kinds of evil that can exist, because we can talk about what exists as natural evils and also as moral evils. So a natural evil is something that is completely independent of any individual human action. So, for example, an earthquake would be described as a natural evil that exists. And then, of course, you've got moral evils. So people like serial killers act in morally evil ways, according to this argument. So we can attack these on the basis of each of the premises. Okay, so we could argue that while this may be a logically valid argument, it is not necessarily logically sound. So this is just from what we've just mentioned. But some have also made the argument that there is reason for evil to exist. Thus, God would not choose to eliminate evil. So if we look back at premise 2, it says that an omnipotent, omniscient, and wholly good being would eliminate evil that existed in the world. Well, according to a number of theological thinkers, they've made the argument that why would this be the case? Okay, there may be a reason for evil to exist, and thus God would not choose to eliminate it. And this is basically the understanding of what we find in a theodicy. So theodicy is simply a word to describe a plausible explanation for why God might allow evil to exist. It is a system of arguments that are essentially meant to present the view that God and evil can both exist in the same universe. We can have a universe where evil exists and also where God exists. And it is a plausible explanation for us to why God might allow evil to exist. And we have a number of historical theodicies that have been proposed throughout history. You've got people like Irenaeus and you've got Augustinian theodicies. These are both examples of religious explanations for why evil might exist. And we will look at them when we explore Christian responses to the problem of evil, specifically Irenaeus and Augustinian theodicy. So you could make the argument that there is reason for evil to exist. And just touching briefly, some have argued that the reason why evil exists is because without evil we would not know what good and what morally good actually looks like. So, for taking the view that you cannot see a shadow without seeing light, for example, you can't see one without the other. There are a number of ways in which we can frame theodicies, and we can look at the plausibility of each of them. But we could also look at the logical argument and attack it on its internal consistency. We can attack it on its actual logical merits. To what extent do the premises actually entail the conclusion? And we can rearrange the argument as follows. We could say that premise 1 is, again, God is an omnipotent, omniscient, and wholly good being. Okay. Premise 2, evil exists, which an omnipotent, omniscient, and wholly good being could have eliminated. Therefore, God does not eliminate every evil that it can properly eliminate. And that's simply the argument. So what we're actually showing here is, if we rearrange this argument, we actually aren't even providing an argument for the non-existence of God. We are just providing an argument that God does not eliminate every evil that can be properly eliminated. If we go back to the original argument, okay, some have made the claim that there is a jump that has been made from the premises to the conclusion, where in reality the premises aren't actually arguing that God doesn't exist, and that it cannot be a conclusion that can be drawn from these premises. The premises are simply arguing that evil does exist and God doesn't eliminate it, because that's all it is showing. It is not showing that God does not exist just because they don't eliminate evil. It is just showing that because it could just as easily be the case that God does exist and they just simply don't eliminate evil, going down the theodicy route. So it's not even necessarily internally consistent either. So we can attack the logical argument on the merits of the premises, arguing that the argument is not sound, And we can also attack the argument on the merits of its logical consistency. We can argue that it's not valid either. So, again, this argument is logically consistent and does not show that God does not exist. It does not show this to be the case. And it simply shows that God does not eliminate evil in the world, and that's all it does. So let's think about the problem of evil from an evidential perspective. Let's take the other argument, okay? The argument from evidence. Because one issue that we must think about when looking at the argument from evidence is removing any kind of bias that could lead to a theodicy. We want to make a situation where we can examine and highlight an evil that exists in the world, okay, that could not be explained using some kind of theodicy. So we've already mentioned very briefly that, for example, we have evil. God allows us to have evil because it shows us what is moral and what is good in the world. Okay, that could be a reason for why why evil is allowed to exist in the world. Okay, that is one example, and we have other examples that we will look at in the next lesson. But what we want to do is we want to eliminate any kind of bias completely, because since a theodicy is an attempt to justify the existence of God and the existence of evil, okay, they end to run on similar lines. So, for example, we have a free will defense. So God has given people free will and therefore has no agency over what these people do. You have the moral agency defense, suggesting that it would be a greater evil, in fact, for people to not have any kind of moral agency. That ties a little bit into the free will defense. You have a higher goods defense, arguing that God doesn't we don't actually know what other kinds of goods can arise out of evil, the existence of evil in the world. Some people argue that evil has to necessarily exist because it leads to other things, okay? And a world without evil may be worse than a world with evil. These are all different ways in which we can attempt to justify the existence of God and the existence of evil. Well, William Rowe tried to develop a theory of evil, an example, a thought experiment when it comes to the existence of evil, that attempts to try and remove all of these biases as much as they can, to the point where you couldn't just simply rely on a theodicy to explain away the existence of this particular kind of evil. So Rowe proposes a challenge to the existence of God from the problem of evil. So again, using a challenge to the existence of God and using the problem of evil to present this challenge, but also attempting to remove any of these responses. So they say that, quote, a fawn is in a distant forest, okay? And then lightning strikes, the fawn is trapped in a forest fire and dies a horrible death, and nobody knows. So this is an example of what can be seemingly described as an evil, okay, that nobody knows about and has no kind of biases. We couldn't say in this example that this is a necessary evil because it shows us where the existence of good. It shows us the existence of good because of this evil. Because nobody knows about it. It's something that has happened independently of any other human experience. And so we can look at this argument. So premise one is that there exists instances of intense suffering which an omnipotent, omniscient and wholly good being could have prevented without thereby losing some greater good or permitting some evil equally bad or worse. So notice that in this premise they are qualifying the existence of evil. They're qualifying a preventable kind of evil. They're saying that there is an evil that could be prevented, and this prevention would not lose some greater good, some higher moral good, like would be in the higher goods defense, and it wouldn't permit some other evil that is equally bad or worse. Okay, so this is the first premise. It tries to eliminate these biases. Premise 2, an omnipotent, omniscient and wholly good being would prevent the occurrence of any intense suffering if it could, unless it could not do so without losing some greater good or permitting some evil equally bad or worse. Again, this is just a variation on the logical argument. It's a variation on the logical argument, but it is qualifying by talking about a greater good or losing some evil that is equally bad or worse. Okay? And then the conclusion again is, therefore, God does not exist. Okay? There does not exist an omnipotent, omniscient and wholly good being. because if they did, then this would be the case. They would have prevented intense suffering if it could, unless it wouldn't do so without thereby losing some greater good or permitting some evil equally bad or worse. Therefore, God does not exist. This is the evidential argument. And what this argument does is it relies on Rowe's thought experiment to sort of illustrate this example, because in this argument it is talking about the preventing some greater good or permitting some evil equally bad or worse. And people might come to the conclusion, well, what example can we think of an evil that, you know, is completely independent and devoid of any other kind of external factor? And we use Rowe's thought experiment of a fawn being trapped in a forest fire as evidence of this kind of evil that is completely independent of human experience, is completely independent of any kind of greater moral good. If this evil was prevented, it wouldn't actually create any worse evil, because it is simply saving the life of an innocent animal in the woods, you know, again, independent of evidential experience. Are there any issues with this argument? Okay, what are the critiques of this argument? There seems to be a lot more logically sound, a lot more logically valid argument, even though it is the evidential argument. Well, does there exist some good that can justify permitting evil in these examples? Okay, can we even though we have provided a thought experiment of the fawn in the forest fire that is arguably the most devoid of any kind of extraneous factors, can we think of examples of some good that can justify permitting evil in these examples? If not, then no good justifies God in permitting the cited examples. Okay? And then we can also have the example of we have some work by William Hasker. So Hasker codifies a slightly different argument based on the problem of evil, and they look at the necessity of what they call gratuitous evil. Okay, and this is touching a little bit on what William Rowe thought of and talked about in their thought experiment, because they are essentially, at least to an extent, implying that there is the existence of this gratuitous evil. Okay. However, this isn't necessarily an argument against the existence of God, but it's an argument that God does not have to prevent even in the most gratuitous evils. So he doesn't have to prevent even the most gratuitous evils. So this is, again, the premises and conclusion form. Premise 1, God has arranged things in such a way that human beings make morally significant free choices between good and evil. Premise 2, in order for human choices to be morally significant, morality must not be undermined. Okay, seems to be the case so far. Premise 3, if God prevents even the most gratuitous evils, then morality is undermined. Premise 4, therefore God is not required to prevent even the most gratuitous evils. Okay, so this is actually a critique of the problem of evil, because it is saying that God has arranged the universe in such a way as to make it the case that human beings will make morally significant choices, choices that that distinguish between choices of good and choices of evil. Okay, this means actually that not just good choices, but there has to also be evil choices made as well, because that gives them moral significance. It gives them moral weight to their choices. Okay. Now, in order for human choices to be morally significant, we cannot undermine the existence of this, of these free choices, of this morality between good and evil, this distinction between what is good and what is evil. And if God prevents all evil from taking place, even the most gratuitous evil, then we are undermining this choice, because we can only choose between good and other goods, because the evil does not exist. Therefore, God is not required to prevent even the most gratuitous evils. And Hasker goes one step further when talking about gratuitous evils, because they're talking about even the most horrific examples of evil that exists in the world. And we can also bring a critique into the problem of evil by talking about things like death. So, and this argument based on looking at death actually illustrates a broader point about possibly the existence and the necessity of the existence of evil. So Swinburne argues that something like the existence of death cannot be viewed as an evil, because we can understand it through a number of other lenses of analysis. So he argues that, for example, it can only be viewed as an evil in the sense that it frustrates desire, as in it frustrates the desire to live. So people have an inherent desire to be alive, and death frustrates that desire because it obviously takes away somebody's life. However, we can justify the existence of death for a number of reasons. So death, for example, sets a limit to pain and torture. Without death, people can inflict near infinite harm. Now, if we were to imagine a world where people never died, then people who are being tortured could be tortured infinitely, and this is something that would therefore create a near infinite harm on these individuals. Death allows, from a sociological perspective, death allows the young to replace the old. And it gives us real responsibility in our choices, since this is something that can be done to harm others permanently. Once you kill somebody, you can't bring them back to life. So we have a situation where if we were to imagine a world without something like death, then we have a number of issues that we can think of in this universe. And the point of this argument, the point of bringing up death and saying, well, this is actually not an evil because of these reasons, is that we could theoretically think of these examples, but replace death with some other kind of evil, with some other kind of thing that exists in the world, and we can understand that we can justify its existence while not necessarily, suggesting that it is moral. We could still condemn some evils, but we can justify its existence and argue that it does give us, there are some utilities to the existence of evil in these ways. And so this is a number of arguments that we've talked about when talking about the problem of evil. In the next lesson, we're going to look at the specific theodicies, so Augustinian theodicies and Irenaeus, and look at some modern spins on those theodicies, and look at how we can use Christian theodicies, and religious arguments to show that we can have a world where God exists, and so we can also have a world where evil exists.